Hello and welcome to another alternate media special. This is the new way we're doing Killing the Church live. Today is going to be an interesting one. It's one that's been requested a few times, maybe combined with a few other different topics that are closely related. So we're going to be talking about head coverings and cross-dressing today. As per the custom, we always have something to drink with us, and since it's before noon, we're both doing Irish coffees. And you've got your nice Irish mug. I have my my music mug. It's got a guitar for the handle and musical notes and stuff.
Neat.
Yeah. And so today what I've mixed with my coffee is... I always have problems with the focus on this camera. There we go. Carolyn's Irish cream.
Nice. I'm jealous. I didn't have an Irish cream on me, so I'm mixing. It's a single pot Irish whiskey called the Sexton. I know it's a weird name, but it's pretty good. But it's not like good enough to sip regularly. It's not one of my favorites, so I use it as a mixer for now.
I actually don't mind the Sexton, believe it or not.
It's
a little harsh.
It's my version of a mixing whiskey, which is still top shelf whiskeys. We got our coffee in our leftist tears mug. I'm showing that one. Let's go.
Yes.
I have one of those mugs somewhere in the house.
I still need to get one. There's a few mugs that I've got to get. A few other things I'm waiting on to come in the mail. I've decided to start buying merch from all of the other channels that we support and stuff like that. You know, and kind of I'm gonna start featuring those, and I won't mention any names of the channels yet, but I've got some coming in the mail that's like we'll be showing some support for other channels here soon.
Oh yeah, yep. I need to get me a particular mug. We already talked about it. You guys know.
Yes.
Yeah. So, with the slight whiskey review out of the way, we're doing this like basically, this is a brunch special, we're calling it. And today's topic is head covering / cross-dressing. There's so much to cover here in this particular area. So let's just jump into it.
All right. Well, so I think probably one of the verses that comes most to mind, especially for those coming out of the Christian background, is going to be from the New Testament. I think you've got the citation on hand from Paul pertaining to head coverings and kind of what it symbolizes for women. I think that's important because I recently did a few videos kind of on the family dynamic in and of itself. And as it would stand, the head covering actually takes a big role in the family dynamic. So you go ahead, because I don't have that citation offhand.
You want me to read the New Testament version of this particular? Okay, yeah. All right, so it kind of is... It's actually a pretty long section. It's all of 15 verses, starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2 through 16. So 15 total verses. But there's just a few that I want to highlight here because we're going to bring up some problems with this passage as we go through it. So now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm the traditions just as I pass them on to you. That's going to illustrate a problem as we move on later. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Messiah is God. There's a Trinitarian verse for you, but that's off topic.
We'll save that for another day.
We'll bring this one up on our next video, Trinity part 3. But every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. but every woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for it is one and the same as having been shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her hair be cut off of her. But if it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or be shaved, let her then cover her head. So there's more to it here as well. But the long and short of it is that this has traditionally been interpreted to mean that men should not pray with a hat on, right? Or in some circles, like a Southern Baptist Convention, I know they have a particular problem with this. You can't so much as teach with a hat on, and then for women, they should always married women particularly, but it doesn't really actually make a distinction here in the English anyway. That women should always have some sort of head covering on, like a scarf or even a hat or what have you, as a modest part of her dress. And of course, we've illustrated the natural question is, for me anyway, when I first read passages like this from the more Hebraic perspective, is what about the kippah? Why is it that men always have a head covering on? And Paul seems to be contradicting that. Is this a tradition that develops later? Or is it normative Judaism in first century that they didn't have head coverings at all? Like, I had a bunch of questions, did a ton of research. And I'm sure some of you have the same questions.
I was going to say also, especially the Tallit in Judaism is used to cover the head when praying. I mean, that's a big part of the Tallit is to cover your head with it when you pray. I think it's also worth noting, considering recent conversations we've had and upcoming conversations we're going to have, that this is one of those aspects of the New Testament, right? Because the anti-Torah position has always been that, well, we only follow that's repeated in the New Testament, right? But they don't even do that, because this is a very very clear example of a standard that modern Christian churches do not hold to this day. When was the last time you went into a Christian church where the women's heads were all covered?
Never.
It's never happened. The only times it's ever happened. Well, yeah, no, same. The only times it's ever happened are in Christian churches where that church is allowing a Messianic congregation to meet, and it's not on a Sunday, it's on a Saturday. And so it's, the setting is not the Christian church itself. I guess, in the older generations, this is why you used to see women wear hats a lot. Particularly in church. I know that in certain more old-fashioned churches, that actually is still a bigger tradition that's kept, is that, a woman would have her Sunday hat that she would wear, and she would wear it to church on Sunday. And that goes back even as recent as like the early 60s. But that's the 60s is kind of where that began to stop, where it began to fade out of American tradition. So yeah, I just wanted to point out real quick that this is a prime example of like, okay, so you say that you only do the things in the New Testament, but you really don't even do that. And that's because there is disagreement on how to interpret this verse.
Yeah. And then, there's a huge cultural aspect to this whole passage, right? One thing that we kind of have to clarify, this is just the historian in me speaking, that in ancient days, like, why would this even be a problem? Today, we use a wedding ring as our identifier, but back then that was not really a thing. Instead, women indicated that they were married via a head covering. So it's sort of, it could be any sort of head covering. It was usually like some scarf-like type of material. And depending on your tradition, it would be tied up in a way that no hair was shown at all. There seems to be an indication that in first century Judea, not necessarily in northern Israel, but in the southern part, it was more like a hoodie. It was just something that just sort of draped, much like the Tallit is, in a similar manner. But so there's this huge culture aspect, and in Corinth is a Greek city, not a Roman one, and with that, in Greek culture, the only people that covered their heads were slaves. So there's actually a disconnect with the Greek Gentile congregation in Corinth that are being welcomed into the synagogue at Corinth, and they see everyone wearing these head coverings, but to them that's a sign of slavery. So they are probably refusing to partake, and that's why Paul even bothers bringing it up to begin with. Is like, hey, I understand that this is a big issue, so here's him trying to tackle like this huge cultural disconnect, which again in Roman culture, men of high stature would actually wear some sort of head covering. It was like a little, it wasn't like a kippah. It was a little bigger than that. It was more like a hoodie, but like a beanie, but it was attached to the clothing. It was weird. I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, yeah. So that's part of why this is even being brought up to begin with. And this is, as far as you and I go, this is like our favorite example of showing how there's a huge Messianic cultural influence on the New Testament.
Absolutely. And I think what's worth noting too is, as I understand, historically speaking here, some of the issues that were going on within this Greek congregation were, especially because it was inherently a growing part of Greek culture at this time, and then also a former part of Greek culture that eventually predated their demise before Rome took over, is the effeminizing of men. And so cross-dressing actually was a legitimate issue in this congregation, because it was pretty standard Greek custom for men to make themselves pretty at this time. It wasn't out of the scope of possibility or even probability at this point, because it was just an inherent part of Greco culture. I mean, the trans identity thing is not really new in society. We treat it like it's new in American culture because it's new in American culture, but almost every ancient culture has had that as part of their culture at some point, usually late in their history.
yeah, right before the falls, usually.
Right.
Funny enough, no, there's again, just coming from the historian's perspective, I feel like I can't speak any other way. I'm very one-dimensional. If you continue reading in the Corinthian passage, right? Paul makes this contrast between men and women. And this is actually why we have made this head covering / cross-dressing, because Paul's emphasis actually seems to be more about cross-dressing than the head covering. The head covering is just the most obvious example in his eyes. So a couple of things. Firstly, a Jewish man in the first century, if he were to walk into a synagogue and see tons of married women with their hair uncovered, it would be, one of the commenters said Michael Heiser has a teaching on contemporary literature that hair was considered a sex organ. That's more or less like Heiser. I've read his work, pretty decent. Not necessarily a sex organ, but it was unruly. Like it would be the equivalent of dressing way down for a church event, like scantily clad, kind of consideration. So for him to like walk into Corinth and see a bunch of married women with their hair uncovered, it's like, what is going on? What are you doing? It was
culturally, culturally, it would be the equivalent of like walking into a church and seeing a bunch of women in swimsuits. More or less. Basically.
More or less. It would be that shocking. It's not, it's not one for one to equivalent, but the shock value would be about the same. Like, what's going on?
Right.
It would be so foreign to him. But on top of that, there was another issue in Corinth where the men were, and then this is where the whole covering issue comes into play, actually. What covering is Paul talking about? Is he talking about a hat? Or are we still on the topic of hair? I would argue that the Greek is really cryptic, and I would argue that it's actually we're still talking about hair, that we're not talking about hats at all in the passage. That's just the way it's been interpreted through traditional Christian circles. And so the other problem in Corinth is that, like you said, men are being more effeminate. They're coming in with long, braided, like women-looking hair. And this is not a stretch of the imagination. You go to Roman culture, Greek culture, any of those, you look at them in ancient history, and transgenderism is in fact a very strong attribute of those cultures. This is not some new thing that we're dealing with now in, present day 2021 America.
Honestly, even Italian culture today.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
It's not uncommon for a man. He may not have long hair, but it's not uncommon in modern Italian culture for a man to have a little bit of an obsession with his own beautification.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong
with
a very
metro
good,
culture.
Yeah, it's the effeminizing portion, and so what we're going to try and argue from this particular passage, there's certain Greek words that give this away, is that the problem is men look like women, and the women are going uncovered, and so it's like, and again, in Greek culture, this was fine, but to the Jewish culture, this was not okay. And we do have to stress that there is a cultural aspect to this whole thing, right? There's no Torah law that says men have to have a hat on and that women have to have a head covering on. But the culture of Torah is so intertwined with Torah that they're inseparable. You can't just take one without the other. What you do is you basically remove the context of one from the other. So you kind of have to bring them two together. And
right.
And Paul opens up with and that's why I love this passage so much. Paul opens immediately with, that you remember, I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm the traditions just as I had passed them on to you.
Yep. This is one of those where one thing you'll notice, and we have created a bit of a distinction between us and like the Hebrew roots movement. That's been kind of a recent development that more so, I guess, I've been driving. And that is because there are inherent differences in our own theology versus that which is esteemed by the Hebrew roots movement. Because they are very, very much against the rabbinic traditions. Like that's a very, very hard, fast point that they maintain right there alongside Christianity. But they love the head covering. All of the women, especially on TikTok and several other YouTube channels that are from the Hebrew roots movement, they will sit and berate the rabbinic oral tradition while wearing a head covering. And they're very emphatic about how women need to wear head coverings. And they don't realize that the head covering is a rabbinic oral tradition. That's why Paul even refers to it this way in this passage. Is he's praising them for having remembered the traditions as he passed them on to them. And so it's just a bit of irony that I see within that movement. It's not that they're wrong. I would support in many ways their love for the head covering among women. Now, I do think in some ways they take it a bit far because they even require it in many of the cases that I've seen. They require it for even unmarried women, and that's not exactly accurate to the rabbinic tradition at this point. That's actually now you've gone farther with the stringency than even the rabbinate had ever intended. It's the head covering for women, especially in the examples that we see throughout the Torah and even the Talmud. It's the word usage there for woman is isha, which is the same word. It's used interchangeably as either woman or wife. And so you could actually transpose or superimpose wife anywhere that you see woman in most of the cases that this is used. For instance, we discussed earlier Leviticus 18:22, where it says you're not to lie with a male as you lie with a woman, or you could read that as you lie with a wife, right? It doesn't actually change the verse or in any way that it would change it. It would actually support sex within the confines of a marriage in that aspect. And so, yeah, the head covering, anywhere that you see it in rabbinic literature or here in the Torah, even, we've got a citation that we're going to be discussing here in a minute. It seems very much to be pertaining to a wife in this instance. And, well, the historian discussed culturally why women who are married wear head coverings versus women who are not married.
So it's actually fairly simple, but again, before the advent of a wedding ring, which is strictly a Western invention, by the way. Nothing wrong with it. It's just a piece of culture. It's more or less, it would fall under the mundane, I guess. So when it comes to the garments, men would always wear, like, we talk about the Tallit here often, and we're actually going to get into this a little bit too in this episode. The Tallit was specifically the big Tallit, the Tallit Gadol, was seen as the male garment. It was culturally that way. The edges, the hems, would have colored stripes on them. You have the coat of many colors. I have the tribe of Judah, the gold and the blue. But every family would have actually a different set of stripes, kind of like
almost like a tartan. Yeah.
So every family had its own unique set of stripes, and so the man would wear the big one representing his family. And this is also why in many Eastern cultures you say the last name first. Like they do this in Japan, for instance. And the woman, whoever he married, he would be the covering over her. So he would, in the wedding ceremony, he would actually take his talit, right, and put it over her as a symbol of him covering and taking authority over her from her father's household. And the head covering that she would wear from that point on would be a smaller, tiny version of that with the family color stripes on it. So you knew whose wife she was. Again, like a family tartan. So that culturally, that the head covering provides a couple of things: a way of telling who is available and who isn't. And we do this with a ring today. And so kind of, again, walking into a synagogue and seeing married women without a head covering was equal to going out, and seeing married women without rings on. It was kind of like a little sus, a little scandalous. And just kind of not okay.
And I guess maybe to amend the swimsuit statement that I made earlier, because that still sexualizes hair more than it was actually viewed in the Jewish culture. I mean, because the idea is not that you'd be walking around seeing young unmarried women in swimsuits everywhere. That's not how that was viewed. But
no.
Hair was viewed to be part of a woman's beauty, and where this comes from is actually it's beautiful. So part of the phrase used when God formed Eve for Adam used there is the same root for the word that indicates to braid, right? And so from this, the rabbinate have derived that God not only formed Eve, but that he braided her hair to kind of to beautify her for Adam, to make her pretty for Adam. And so we gather from this that a woman's hair is part of what makes her beautiful. Like that is part of her beauty. And because a woman's beauty is strictly for her husband, when she's married, she covers that beauty, right? That's only for her husband's eyes at that point. But a young unmarried woman, she's trying to attract a mate. So what does she do? Well, she wears her hair uncovered, right? Because that's beautiful. It's the advertisement, that she's single and available. And so it's cultural, but it's beautiful in its own right. And I personally really appreciate that. Now, there are certain more and from what I've come to understand, much more strict fringe circles of Judaism that take this to an extreme where, like, married women after getting married will even shave their heads so that the hair that is grown from that point forward has only ever been seen by their husband. But that's an extreme position that is not common in Judaism, as I've come to understand.
Yeah, typically the married woman would only wear the covering in public. There are a few instances of they're called extremely pious women who would even wear their covering in their own house. Saying, I can't remember the quote or the reference to the quote, but the quote is like, even the beams of this house have not seen the beauty of my hair, or something.
Right.
A really, really righteous woman going above and beyond the call of duty. To each their own, right? This is not, again, this is a very cultural thing we're talking about here.
Yep.
The only thing that makes this a biblical commandment is the fact that it's in the New Testament. You're not going to find this anywhere else. It's not a Torah restricted. There's a couple of comments asking about, is it breaking Torah to not wear a head covering? No. It's a culture thing that is attached to Torah. It's definitely within the Messianic, like the oral traditions. But if you're not married, covering is not necessary. And if you are married, Paul would tell you a covering is necessary. And again, Paul is coming from an incredibly Judaic background. Now, again,
yep.
Paul didn't even live long enough to hear the word Christian. Paul was operating solely within the idea that the way was a sect of Judaism. So
right.
That's a big part of this too.
Right. And just to address another comment that I did see much earlier about this is the idea of wigs, which is, again, that's accepted in every branch of Judaism. But in some branches of Judaism, a woman she might cut her hair just short enough to where it doesn't interfere with a wig that she will wear, so that you don't see her real hair. What you're seeing is her wig. And this came about.
Cut you off, but that's only true for the first couple of years of marriage, by the way.
Right. Yeah. And even well, when I say cut it just short enough to where it doesn't interfere with a wig, what I've seen is most of them cut it like just at like shoulder neck length, right? And they'll get a wig that's long enough to where that doesn't interfere. So they still have, a decent amount of hair there. But be that as it may, the idea of the wig, right? It seems like it's skirting the issue, or like it's a loophole or something like that. And there are Jews out there who do agree with that. They think that it's creating a loophole, more or less. The reason that it came about, that's been explained to me anyway, is initially because part of the mandate in Judaism for head coverings is also modesty. Because modesty is understood as being one of the feminine traits. And modesty doesn't mean necessarily what we think it means in the West. Modesty in a Semitic understanding is literally anything that draws attention to the self. Whether or not it's beautification or just because it's so drastically different, right? If it's something that draws attention to you, then this is not modest. And so living in a Western culture, in a Western society where none of the women cover their hair, a head covering stands out like a sore thumb and draws attention to oneself. So this created a dilemma in the Jewish community. How do women keep their heads covered without drawing attention to themselves and maintaining modesty standards by this metric of modesty standard? And so the wig was the alternative here, because their hair is covered, but they're not drawing attention to themselves because it looks natural enough, right? Go ahead.
No, yeah, there's a context to everything, right? I think I made I did a rant where I said, everything sounds silly until you actually give it a good chance. And I used the toilet paper analogy. So, that's a great example of how, like, you can just take an idea, hear it for the first time and laugh it off. And like, that's stupid. That's silly. Why would you do that? Like, you're an idiot. And you've already shut your brain off to hearing any reason And that's a great example of how like there's actually a reason, there's a context, there's an understanding, and to simply dismiss it is to do a huge disservice to the reason why traditions come about to begin with.
Right. Now, on the flip side, the alternative view that I've heard from a Jew on this is that because the wigs themselves are pre-styled and so perfectly done, that this still draws attention to the self, and so it actually skirts the point of wearing a wig. So, where there's two Jews, there's three opinions.
Yeah, and 4 synagogues.
Right. But okay, so I think to shift gears though here, because we've touched on the cross-dressing aspect of this, sort of. There's still more to be discussed here when we get into Deuteronomy. So, the subject of the Tallit, because that's a question that I even recently have been asked, is okay, like, is it wrong for me as a woman to be wearing a Tallit? Like, my family has a Tallit and I wear it when I pray. Is this wrong for me? And there's naturally there's the huge debate between the Nazarene and the Hebrew roots as to whether or not it's okay for women to wear tzitzit, right? Or whether or not it's mandated is the difference. Is the Hebrew roots, because they take a literal approach to this. And when I say literal, I don't mean like Peshat reading. I mean literal to a point of kind of missing the direction that the Torah itself was given in. But they view it as a mandate that both men and women have to wear tzitzit. Whereas the Nazarene approach that you and I take here would be that, well, they can, on their head coverings or some form of a four-cornered garment, but the Tallit specifically is a man's garment. But that there's no it's not obligatory for women the way that it is for men.
Right. Like it kind of becomes an issue of semantics, where I've been asked this question before and I sort of have to clarify, do you mean should you wear a Tallit or should you wear tzitzit? Because they are two different things. And if you want to wear tzitzit on a four-cornered garment of some sort, by all means. Like my wife, she usually has like a really, really thin scarf that she uses as a head covering. It's just this big, long rectangle. It's got 4 proper corners. And so there are tzitzit on the 4 corners of that. And she's only ever wearing the tzitzit when she's got her head covering on, which is actually, because she's in the military. So she actually doesn't, she has to wear an actual like cover most of the time. Funny enough. But like, yeah, to wear the Tallit specifically, what you are violating is a cultural cross-dressing norm in Paul's eyes.
Well, I would even go so far as to say not necessarily in Paul's eyes, and this is where I would contend that Hebrew roots do not take as much of a literalist approach, because if we look at Deuteronomy 22:5, okay, it says that a woman is not to put on a man's apparel. And other translations may even say that a woman is not to wear that which pertains to a man, nor shall a man wear a woman's clothing. Now, apparel and clothing, those are not the same Hebrew words, and there is a reason for that. And it says, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Now, this is actually another one of those verses that screams as to the existence of an oral tradition passed down from Moses, right? Because it begs the question, okay, what is woman's apparel? Or, what is a man's apparel? What is woman's clothing? What are these things, right? Because if we say that it's cultural, well, culture changes, right? Initially, pants were for women. And now it's a man. Now, especially in like the independent fundamental Baptist circles, it's viewed as strictly a man's garment. And it's like, well, that's not how it was created initially. Initially, its intent was for women. So are men wearing women's clothing in these churches? Or, culturally, because of the nature of man's work and the work that men did on a daily basis, pants were more convenient. Ergo, it became a man's garment. So we're not speaking about something cultural here. that's too subjective and too prone to changing for God to say, okay, well, men, you can't wear women's clothing, women, you can't wear men's clothing, and that is entirely up to what you as a culture decide those things are. That's a ridiculous assertion to make. Clearly, God has in mind specific things that are not to be worn by either men or women. And so this is where the subject of, okay, are we talking about a head covering when we're talking about women's clothing? Are we talking about a tallit when we're talking about a men's apparel? And as the Targum Jonathan would actually translate it, yes. So the Targum Jonathan says, neither fringed robes nor tefillin, which are the ornaments of a man, shall be upon a woman. Neither shall a man shave himself so as to appear like a woman. For everyone who doeth so is an abomination to the Lord thy God. And that's an interesting one too there. The idea that shaving is considered cross-dressing in Judaism.
Yep.
And some of the Talmudic tractates on that are very interesting because it's not just shaving in general, but they have actually also derived from this that if you are a man who is beginning to gray in the beard, and so you trim specifically the gray hairs and the white hairs so that all that shows is your youthful, hairs, that this is also a violation of this. And that's because gray hair is a symbol of wisdom in and of itself in Judaism. So like, when you read this and you read that and you think about, the what's the hair dye or the Just for Men's gel that like
not Keeps. What is it? It's like Rogaine or whatever.
Yeah. It's the stuff that men who are graying start to wear so that they look younger. And it's like, well, that's not the point.
I think that's starting to go away. Actually, I'm starting to see a shift in the culture where everyone wants the salt and pepper look now. So
that's because it's now become very attractive among like women. Women are starting to vocalize that they like the salt and pepper look, and so men are keeping it now.
It's because men are becoming so effeminate that it's so hard to find a true man that women are like, listen, guys, we want men.
It's evidence of something that Jordan Peterson has pointed out, actually, when he says that women are nature, right? Like they literally are nature, in that women essentially decide whose genes get carried on, right? So, when a guy asks a woman out on a date and she declines him, even if it's subconsciously, pretty much what she's just said is that your genes are surely not good enough to carry on. that's from a biological standpoint. But yes, and so men and man's culture will acquiesce to whatever women view as being attractive, and that's actually partially why the effeminization of men became so popular. Watching some old like late 90s and early 2000s shows and seeing like the Chad Michael Murray and Sam Winchester and stuff like that, like these are extremely effeminate men who were viewed as extremely attractive by the young women of their days, and so this is the look that every man in society aspired to, and that's where we got the Chads from.
Jeez, we just circled back to a meme.
Yep, memes are everything.
Memes are bae. Memes are mood. Memes are life. That's going on a t-shirt. Memes are bae.
but yeah, so yeah, it's interesting that they actually do tie this to the shaving. That what they derive from the idea of a man wearing woman's garments is not actually to do with the clothing necessarily, but that it has to do with a man attempting to beautify himself, right? Because that's not something that a man should be concerned with, which is not to say that a man shouldn't be concerned with at least being presentable. There are certain, especially pertaining to a king, there are certain grooming standards that are laid out. As it would have it, they're actually very reasonable, and if a man adheres to those, he will look relatively presentable.
The idea in Judaism, and this is all the way from the 1st century and beyond. I'm sure some of you may have seen this picture that went around a long time ago, of what Jesus would have looked like, and it's an archaeological rendering of a typical Galilean Jew, and he looks like a very round face, Middle Eastern looking guy. And what I love about the picture is that they have him with a nice trim beard. Like, it's not super long, he's not clean shaven, but it's just a good trim. And it looks really professional. And that's very common of the rabbis of their day. Is the idea was to appear as professional as possible while still maintaining, the standards of dress for a man. So,
Right.
like myself, so putting a razor against your face, marring the face with a razor, is a violation of Torah command. And in Judaism, they've actually ruled that you can trim your beard so long as everything you trim it with has a scissoring action, right? So like scissors, trimmers, anything that scissors to cut. So electric razors are actually perfectly halachic to use, an electric razor. And because my stuff comes in really patchy on the sides, it basically doesn't grow in at all in some areas, because my Irish genes hate me. And so I'm really only able to have a good looking professional kind of goatee kind of style. And so I electric razor the sides to keep this as professional as looking as possible while still maintaining the fact that I am a man. I wear a man's garments on my face.
Yep. I used to do the same anytime we would go to the Pirate Invasion Festival. And so I would just leave like, the chin strap and the mustache bars and get that, Johnny Depp look. But for the rest, I would use the electric trimmer to trim down the rest and give that French-esque pirate look.
Yep. And I same in the Marines. When I go on duty, I can only keep the mustache. And so I do. I electric shave everything else. And I am given a religious exemption. I don't have to have a perfectly clean shave, but I still am expected to look in uniform to an extent.
Right. Well, in that scenario, you are not your own.
Yeah.
That's this, I would say, it to a certain extent would fall under certain of the laws pertaining to slavery, more or less, because you have signed a contract that renders you belonging to the government. And so you do have to maintain the standards that your master at that point.
You paused on me. Oh, there you are.
There we go.
Quick question. So I'm going to put it up on the screen here. I thought the rounding of the beard forbids a goatee. So there's the commandment against the rounding of the head. And this is actually pertains to your haircut. There is the only forbidden commandments are against the edges of your beard, that you cannot put a razor to the edges. There's actually a whole halachic discussion in the Talmud about what constitutes the corners of your face and what you can and can't shave with a razor. Because essentially you can shave with a razor everywhere else on your body except the corners of your beard. And so there's even a discussion like, well, what if you shave the sides of your face and leave the corners? Are you good? And they're like, yeah, you'd be fine. However, what if you accidentally shave too far and you hit a corner? So they just forbade it entirely. But to shape your facial hair in any way, shape, or form is perfectly fine as long as you don't put a razor to your face. You can even be clean cut. Halachically, like technically you can be clean cut. Like Ben Shapiro is an Orthodox Jew and he's clean cut. And that's mostly because he has to maintain a modern Western professional standards is to have a clean face.
Even if you see a close-up picture of him, though, like if it's a close enough picture, you see that he kind of has a permanent, like 12 o'clock shadow.
Like shadow. Yeah, because he doesn't use a razor. He uses an electric trimmer. And so you can do that. Now it's discouraged, right, in Judaism, because you are still making yourself to look like a woman. And so the idea is to have some facial hair on your face. That way you distinguish yourself as being a man. Right. But it is not a violation to shape your beard in any way, shape, form, or fashion, as long as you're within the boundaries of the halacha. So while we're on the topic of cross-dressing, though,
right?
Do you want to you had something to say? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no. Well, I was just going to say real quick that on this subject of, okay, so what constitutes the corner of your face? What constitutes the corners of the head and whatnot? This again screams as to the necessity of an oral tradition, right? Because you have these questions and they're undefined, right? Because at a certain point, not all facial hair grows on the face or on the head. There's a certain point where it actually begins to creep down into the neck. Okay. So is that the corner of your head? Is that the corner of your beard? So if so, how far up? Like, can you trim that? There are certain necessary specific standards in order to determine this. Another one, even pertaining to the Tallit, which I just read through that whole section in the Shulchan, is the Tallit is supposed to have these tassels on its four corners. Okay. Well, how far up the garment can you make a hole to loop it through before it's no longer the corner of the garment? Right? It seems like it's arbitrary, but it's not. There's a certain point where it doesn't constitute a corner anymore.
Yeah. Like I've been asked this question. My shirt doesn't have it. You see a polo shirt, and for some reason they have like that little cut on the sides.
Right.
And so there's like these two tiny little corners. And so I've had people ask me, well, can I put seat on those corners there of the shirt? And it's like, well, I mean, at the absolute most literal version of the scripture, that would constitute a corner. But there's a rich array of the halacha in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, the Gemara. There's a ton that says that doesn't constitute a corner because it's not the corner of the garment. It is simply in like a little edge. The corner has to go, in order for it to be a corner, basically it has to be more than 40% of the garment, right? To constitute a corner or something like that. So that cut would have to go all the way up to the armpit. And then that's an actual no crap corner, separate from another corner. It has to be that you can spread the garment out and have the four corners so separate that they're distinguishable. And so like, there's stuff here. So like, do you want to live, halachically, like within the bounds of what Judaism has more or less passed down for centuries on what this commandment is supposed to mean? Or do you want to take it at face value and give your own interpretation and say, well, to heck with their traditions, I think it's this. And it's a very arrogant position, actually. It's why it bothers me when people dismiss the oral traditions. It comes off very arrogantly. It's very much, for 5,000 years, Judaism has got it wrong. I've been alive for 25 years and I know what I'm doing and I've got it right. That's kind of, to me anyway, that's how it comes off. So yeah.
Right. And we see, at least with respect to the Targums and how this verse was understood in Deuteronomy, at least to the Jews of the first century. Targum Jonathan dates back to the first century. This is a Targum that Yeshua himself would have been familiar with. And I dare say, really, if he had such a problem with all of these rabbinic standards, we really would have read about him addressing more than just hand washing. And that I think is the thing that's the most noteworthy to point out. We get this idea of Yeshua that his position was so anti-rabbinic tradition, when in reality, if you ask anybody about it, the only example of a rabbinic mandate that they can ever find that Jesus seems to have opposed, and I say seems to, therefore, for a reason, is hand washing. It's literally the only one. And coincidentally, the type of hand washing and the mandate that they are referencing is utterly absent in Judaic literature. Doesn't exist.
And even then, he actually doesn't condemn the hand washing itself.
Right. But I think to that, right? Because the question, is it okay for a woman to wear a talit? So the Targum Jonathan understanding and interpretation of this verse in Deuteronomy would be, no, that's a man's garment. The talit specifically is a man's garment. And the reason is, as Paul dictates, right? So Paul says that the husband is the covering over a wife, and that Christ is the covering over the husband, and God the covering over Christ, right? So you don't need a tallit. Your tallit is your husband's tallit. And we see this at the wedding, right? You are included under his tallit as he wears it. He is the one wearing it, and you are the one who is brought underneath it, okay? Because it is a man's garment. Now, with respect to this, it's been pointed out, right? Because we explained in another video that with respect to this, the command is addressed to Bnei Israel, sons of Israel, right? And so one of the points brought up was, what are you trying to show here?
Just keep talking. It's for the audience.
Oh, okay.
At my wedding, I used my tallit, and you can see I'm covering my wife. Yeah.
We should have had this picture prepared to share on screen.
Yeah, we should have, but we'll make do.
That was an awesome wedding too. Little short story for everybody, because there's supposed to be an exchange of glasses of wine, and I was one of the two best men that were here at this wedding, and I was the one who had to pour the wine, and so I poured the better part of a full glass. There's 4 glasses, there's 4 cups of wine at this wedding, and I poured the better part of a full glass each of those 4 times.
Listen,
his bride only took a small sip.
It's a great joke, even.
So he had to chug 4 glasses of wine for the duration of this wedding.
And we had taken a shot of Bushmills just before the wedding.
It was the same bottle.
Take the edge off, right? And then we get out there, and he pours a massive, and I hand it to Ariel, and I kind of give her this look, and I'm like, please help me out with this one. And she went, taste. And I was like, oh boy. And you can't leave the glass full.
No.
So I'm like, no. So I down it, right? I'm like, cool. That's one. I shoot Brad a look, and I'm like, not. And he went, cool, I got you, fam. Good. Completely ignored me. I'm like freaking out, like, dude. And then I nearly dropped her.
Another cool thing. Yeah, so we did have we just taken a shot before we went out, because in this format of a wedding, it's the bride who awaits the groom, right? That's biblical. The bride awaits the groom. So it's not the bride who walked in with her father. The bride's already there waiting, and the groomsmen walk in, ushering in the groom, right? So there's before all of us walk out to an awesome musical score and everything, and we looked awesome. We all took a shot of whiskey, Bushmills, and it was the same bottle that we had at the stag party, because unfortunately that was just me and Seamus. We were the only two who really could celebrate, before his being married. So it was like our way of including all of the groomsmen in on that party. They got to drink from the same bottle that we had there.
Yeah, you saved it.
And it was awesome.
But, so back to the topic.
Right, back to the main topic. You're included under his tallit, right? His tallit is your tallit, but he's the one who wears it. You're included under that. And when it comes to what I've heard in response is that it is, even the dietary laws are addressed to the sons of Israel, right? Bnei Israel. And one of the common retorts to this is that even if it was a group of people who were 99% female, if there was one male among them, they would be referred to in the masculine form to acknowledge the male presence. And while there's some truth to that, that's not necessarily applicable to this, to the whole of the Torah, because understand, we aren't even told how many women or children were present at the giving of the Torah. What we're told is that 600,000 men were at the giving of the Torah. The whole Torah is addressed to men. Even the parts about it that are pertaining to women are addressed to men. Why? Because the men are the heads of the society, right? You don't have to tell the women, hey, you can't eat pork. If you tell the men, hey, you can't eat pork, then the men are the ones who enforce that the rest of society doesn't eat pork at that point. Right.
This is true in the Garden of Eden as well, by the way.
Right. You've been in the military. A lieutenant doesn't have to tell all of the privates what's going to go down. All he's got to do is tell his sergeants. The sergeants are going to take care of what the privates know.
Yeah, a private should never see a lieutenant up close ever. That we are the go-between. So,
right, right, and so that's what we've got here with respect to the Torah. The whole of the Torah is addressed to the 600,000 men who were at Sinai, because they are the heads of their households, and so their households have to fall within the boundaries of the set standard that Hashem has told the men they have to live by. So yeah, B'nai Israel, you could plead the argument about acknowledging any form of male presence, but what we gather from the Torah itself, and what's important about this actually is in Deuteronomy 6, even we see this blatantly spelled out, right? What is said is, oh goodness, hang on. Let me find it. It's in Deuteronomy 6.
I believe you. The Shema?
Well, yeah, it's actually I'm pretty sure it's just prior to the Shema. But Hashem is spelling out that he's giving it to them because they will teach their he's giving it to them, their sons and their grandsons. And that's the citation I'm looking for here. You can go ahead and talk while I'm looking for it.
Yeah, no. So the question that I posed at some point is: so what about the head coverings, right? On the kippah. What about the kippah?
Yes. Okay. So hold on. It begins in verse 1, and this is the instruction, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart to you, to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you, your children, and your grandchildren is how the JPS translates this here, but it's literally all of those are masculine nouns. It's you, your sons, and your grandsons.
Yeah, that's the modern translations are going more towards a gender neutral bend, and that kind of, it only bothers me in that it gets rid of the nuance behind some of the gendered language. And it also, you're just bowing the knee to the god of wokeism, and I can't stand that.
Right.
So, moving forward though, because there's still the problem of you and I, we both wear head coverings. We both wear a hat all the time. I never go into public without it, except on a very rare occasion where I either forgot it or I have to be on duty or at work or something like that. There's a few reasons for that, and it has something to do with the Corinthians passage here. But so we get this commonly a lot, hey, you always wear a hat. I do my daily prayers. I have my siddur here, and I got my Tallit right there, and I put it over my head. Is this a violation of the Corinthians passage? And again, I want to stress that this passage is specifically talking about the length of your hair. And so I'm going to kind of work through this passage really quickly, and then me and you can go over the historical origin of the kippah if you want.
Sure.
So, all right, starting in verse 4, so we already talked about 2 and 3. So that the head of every man is the Messiah, right? So we're talking about authority now. So this is specifically about symbols of authority. Every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. That Greek word covered, I had it pulled up here on an article. It's actually the word that is always associated with a hair, with like locks of hair. Let me see here. It starts with a K. I'm looking for the word. Okay. Kome, or long locks of hair. And so it says covering or covered, but and that's not untrue, but it's kind of like the English's best version, but it probably should say something along the lines of like hair covering, like long locks or something like that. So every man praying or prophesying with his head with long hair on is dishonoring his head, but every woman praying or prophesying with her hair uncovered dishonors her head. And this is a separate Greek word now, and you could use it for both the hair covering, as in with short hair, or with an actual like cloth on. Again, a different word for that. Let me find it. Periboleion. Greek is, I'm much better at Hebrew, so excuse me. And then again, it's the same as having been shaved. So we're still talking about hair. I'll move on to verse 7. For surely a man ought to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of God. So he shouldn't have long hair. The woman is the glory of man, for a man is not from woman, but a woman from man. Neither was a man created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. This is the reason a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, some sort of covering. Because of the angels. That's an interesting verse. There's a lot of mysticism tied to that beyond the scope of this podcast. That's actually probably something we should hit for the Patreon specifically, because there's a lot there mystically.
Yes.
For the sake of the angels. In any case, in the Lord, women is not independent of man, and man not independent of woman. Again, we're using the word woman here. Most likely it means wife, because they're largely interchangeable. Colloquialistically, if that's even a word. Even though the word is woman, it is used particularly in the context of a married woman. So, verse 13, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Doesn't the natural order of things, this is the key portion, the natural order of things teach you, if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace for him. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair was given to her as a covering. But if anyone intends to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do God's communities. That's the key giveaway. Again, the Greek here is really weird. Paul was not the best at Greek. In fact, he had a scribe write everything for him, particularly. And he was made fun of in Athens. He was called seed picker because his Greek was like pretty elementary. Like he was picking pieces of Greek that he did know, like a seed picker. But yeah, that's the key portion here. If a man has long hair, it's a disgrace for him. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, and her hair was given to her as a covering. But if anyone intends to be contentious, this is another key portion. We have no such custom, nor do God's communities. So, where does the Kippah come in? Let's talk about the Kippah now.
Right. So it's pretty well accepted that this beanie type, gonna have to remember the god of wokeism. Yeah, it's pretty well accepted that the Arabic beanie looking headdress was pretty common, even in the Israeli communities at this point. But it was much bigger, and it was something that was much more easily kept on the head. The kippah we don't really see until the time of the Babylonian captivity, and especially even I think it had an extreme precedence during like the period of the Crusades, and the time period where you had a lot of Jews living among Arabs and in Arabic communities where they were second-class citizens, more or less. And in many of these communities, it was very specifically illegal to make eye contact with an Arab for a Jew. And so what they developed to maintain a constant posture of humility, right? A constant posture of keeping the eyes to the ground, so that you never had reason to look up and make eye contact with an Arab, was this small disc that you had to keep balanced on the backside of your skull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's evidence of the kippah does exist in first century Judaism, but the idea of a kippah being mandated in Jewish law is a medieval period thing, like 800, 900 AD. But it was definitely common. It was worn by mostly the history tends to show that the kippah was primarily worn by pious Jews, very religious Jews. So rabbis would have worn them. Particularly observant lay people, if they wanted to, would wear them. It wasn't a mandate, but it was a thing that they would do sometimes. And then definitely the Tallit as a hood, basically during times of prayer, was still a normal thing. It was part of the Amidah, the standing prayer. But to wear a head covering constantly was more of a choice, and usually it was preferred by the scholars or the more pious. So it does exist. And so there's actually a little bit of reason to believe that Paul himself would have had a kippah on, being a Pharisee himself, if not a kippah, some sort of head covering like a hood. He may have even just chose to wear his tallit constantly. Given that his words are things like, pray without ceasing, I would believe that he would basically have his tallit on over his head at all times.
So it's interesting, actually, what we can derive from the silence of the religious Jews in the New Testament. And people may say that this is an argument from silence, but it's really not. You're not pleading at what isn't there, even though you are, because what you're pleading at is what should be there, right? I would say probably even Yeshua wore a kippah. Why? The Pharisees never asked him why he didn't. Right? Right. So I'm not appealing to information that's not there. I'm appealing to information that should be there if he didn't. Right. What do we understand about the Pharisees is that they did challenge every time that he did something that was different. Mm-hmm. Right. They made a point to challenge these. Right. Why do some of your disciples, again, some being the operative word there, why do some of your disciples eat with unwashed hands? Right. Which is, again, important because the accusation is not at him in particular. It's not even at all of his disciples. It's just some of them. And so we see that they're not just challenging what he does different. They're challenging anything that his disciples even do that's different. Okay. So I'm not appealing to information that's not there. I'm appealing to information that should be there, right? If he didn't wear a kippah, then what I know for a fact is the Pharisees would have asked him why.
Yeah, and it would have probably been something to bring up in the Gospels, right?
Sure.
At least, if not in the John, definitely the Synoptics would have somewhere, right? Like Q document, L or M document, what have you. It should have been preserved. I say this all the time. If Yeshua had a problem with the Pharisees, he was never afraid to bring it up, and the Pharisees likewise were never afraid to bring up problems with him, to him. And we use the same logic when it comes to, pronouncing the name of God. We know Jesus never did it because it was never brought up. And if Jesus had a problem with not pronouncing the name, then surely he would have said something, but he didn't. And by 2nd century BC, we know that saying the name has already been banned for a few hundred years by now. So,
right.
So yeah, it's appealing to information that's not there because everything in the Gospels is nothing but information that stands out. If Jesus were exactly Jewish in every way, shape, form, and fashion, he had nothing different, there would be no Gospels at all. He would be a normal everyday Jew. So every time there's no information there, it's because it is presumed that this was normal, that he did the normal thing, except in the cases that are listed in the Synoptic Gospels. Essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the kippah, here's what I usually say on that. I don't wear a kippah because I don't want to give off the impression that I am a convert or a natural born Jew, that I'm Jewish in some way. Now that's a personal decision of mine. I don't want to be deceitful, even if it's, from somebody else's perspective and that's on them. But I do, especially if I'm wearing tzitzit, always have something covering my head because that might be a stumbling block for another Jew who might see me wearing tzitzit, head uncovered. That would be so offensive to him. Not in like, I'm offended, change your ways. But it would just be, it would confuse and it would shut him down from conversation to begin with. He'd probably think very negatively of me.
Well, also one of the other things that's kind of tied to the exact same time period as when the kippah was worn for these reasons is, especially in the Spanish Inquisition, tucking in tzitzit, right? Tucking them into one's pants. This is something that's highly disputed. especially in Messianic communities, Hebrew roots communities, because the command is pretty clear that, the idea behind the tzitzit is that you are to see them and remember the commandments, right?
Mhm.
But what was practiced heavily during the Spanish Inquisition, medieval Europe, and on into Renaissance age Europe, is the Jewish men tucking their tzitzit into their pants so that they wouldn't necessarily be recognizable as Jews, more or less. And this was for their own protection, right? This
Yeah.
was so that they would not be killed. And this is something that some in the Messianic community have adopted today for the same reasons that you don't wear a kippah. It's not necessarily to hide the fact that, we're being observant from an enemy, but so as not to offend someone who is Jewish, who may be offended at the sight of a Gentile wearing tzitzit, especially if that Gentile is wearing tzitzit without a head covering.
Yeah.
That is something. If you're wearing tzitzit, you really should be wearing some kind of head covering.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're going to appear to follow the Jewish faith, and even for the sola scriptura crowd, right, where it's only the Torah and not the rest of the Jewish faith. The fact remains is if you have tzitzit on, especially if they're on your belt loops, which is a problem in and of itself, but if you have tzitzit on, you are doing a Jewish custom. There's nothing in the Torah that tells you how tzitzit should look, or how they should be tied, and yet many Messianics tie them and make them look exactly the way that modern Judaism has them look today. And so you have a lack of distinction being made there. And so at glance, you appear to be a Jewish practitioner who is out of line because you have no head covering, or you have it on your belt loops, or some other problem with the commandment. You appear to be completely out of line, and that's not you. You've shut down the possibility of conversation even to be taken seriously. And again, this, not for nothing. If you're a Gentile, these are not your scriptures. These are theirs. They are the people of the book. And we should be a lot more humble about how we approach our observance and respect the way that they have interpreted for thousands of years on how to be observant in this way, because it is their book. It's not ours. You've been merely adopted into this family tree. And so it is up to you to look up to Big Brother for the example.
Right. The adopted sibling has it's not even the same as a newborn sibling in this aspect, because a newborn sibling is a clean sheet of paper, right? Utterly ignorant. But an adopted sibling is not a clean sheet of paper. That's a sheet of paper that has now had what was written on it erased.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not exactly the same. We've grown up in a completely different lifestyle with completely different standards. And so it's certainly not our place to kick their door in and presume to teach them about their own book. They've grown up with the house rules their whole life.
Yeah. Real quick, I thought you were one law question here. What about what did we say gave the impression that we weren't one law? Just drop that in the comment, because I don't think we gave off the impression that we were not one law, because we are. For those of you who do know me, like in the Discord server, I'm the Ger Toshav in that Discord server, and I do that for a reason.
Yep.
What else? So we wear covering. And we, as Nazarene, as you and I both, we adhere to a lot of oral tradition. There are very few instances in which we don't. Go ahead.
Let me address real quick. Yeah, the whole Nazarene thing, because up earlier, one of the comments said that they had seen a lot of Nazarene in the Hebrew Roots Movement's videos, and yes, they do try and co-opt the titles of several other of the Torah practicing groups. They try and also claim the title Messianic. Even though there are stark contrasts and differences between each of these groups. Nazarene especially is something that doesn't even necessarily apply to Messianics. The origin of calling ourselves Nazarene comes from the Jewish tradition of naming a sect of Judaism after the town that the rabbi who founded it came from, right? So you have the Lubavitcher Jews, their rabbi comes from Lubavitch. You have the Breslover Jews, their rabbi comes from Breslau, right? You have this is a pretty common practice, and it's a Jewish tradition. Okay, so according to this Jewish tradition, our rabbi, right, comes from Nazareth. All right. So our sect is called Nazarene, right? That's what we call ourselves after that. The reason I say that the Hebrew roots, especially, even though they're trying to claim this title, do not get to call themselves that is because their entire movement is predicated on the rejection of Jewish tradition. So you don't just get to pick and choose through the traditions that you like, and then co-opt those. This, like I said, the same with the head coverings, right? This is a Jewish tradition that they've adopted because they like the way it sounds, and they like the mystical implications of it, which that's par for the course for Hebrew roots. They're very much predicated on Gnosticism and secret knowledge. So it makes sense that the women in that movement would be very, very enamored by the mystical undertones of wearing a head covering for a woman. But yeah, so my position on that is really they don't get to call themselves Nazarene because they reject Jewish tradition, and calling yourself Nazarene is a Jewish tradition that really only fits within the group that actually adheres to Jewish traditions.
Yeah, we can basically use this time to real quick hash that out. Like, when we use the term Nazarene, we specifically mean a group of a subsection, I guess, of the Messianic movement that adheres to a much more strict observance to the Torah laws, as well as the traditions that were passed down by the rabbinate. So basically, in a nutshell, a Nazarene looks more like an Orthodox Jew than any of the other subsects of Messianic Judaism. Our appearance is far closer to the modern day Orthodox Jew, or at least in certain aspects, like I would say probably closer to the first century Orthodoxy, which a lot of modern Orthodoxy, there's a lot of carryover, but not everything, right? But there's a ton of carryover. And so it's almost indistinguishable, especially to the layperson. They look at us and they see seat, the hat on the four-corner garment. We're dressed nice. We keep the beard. We do Sabbath in just about every way that is prescribed in the oral traditions and stuff like that. So that's how we use the word.
To put it very simply, we are the branch of Torah practicing believers that Orthodox Judaism has the least contention with. That's the easiest way to put it.
Yeah, actually, I would say. I've had a few conversations with Jews on TikTok that led in that direction. Because once you basically say something like, I believe that Yeshua taught for me to accept the authority of the rabbis, and that doesn't mean I have to agree with them all the time, but I have to, he taught that. Once you make that point, a lot of Jews go, oh, I mean, we do the same thing. We, like I follow the Baal Shem Tov, and I don't agree with everything, but I follow the traditions of the rabbi. Like there's a lot of now you have common ground, and so they usually are a little bit more friendly to us. I've noticed anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, and go ahead.
I was say we're approaching an hour and a half now, so it might be time to reel it in.
No. Last point: cross-dressing is idolatry. And
no. Expound on that because that's important.
Yeah. And I do plan to do a rant on this at some point, like a separate rant video.
See, we should have played my rant video before I explained what Nazarene was.
We should have. Actually, do you want to rant about the idolatry thing, and we'll play the video?
I'm not sure of exactly everywhere that you're going to go with that, and so no.
Oh, okay. Well,
tell you what, we'll play both.
I'll play mine first though, since I'm about to rant. cross-dressing is idolatry, and here's why. Essentially, you are worshiping yourself. You are denying your creator by saying, you screwed up. I'm in the wrong body. That's your fault. I'm fixing your problem. That's easily idolatry, to say that God screwed you up in some way, shape, or form. To cross-dress is a small version of transgenderism, which in Jewish culture, it fits into the category of transgenderism, trying to appear as a woman. Now, an argument can be made for theatrics, right? If you're doing theater or something like that, an argument can be made there. But to do it for yourself is a worship of the self and a denial of being created in the very image of God, and denying that he made you as you are and that you should accept the way that you are as you are, and work on yourself to better yourself using the Torah as your metric by how you should make improvements on yourself, because that is the godly image that you were meant to be made in. But to go the opposite route, to directly contradict the Torah and to directly contradict God, basically tell him he screwed up and he's wrong, is probably one of the worst forms of idolatry that I can think of. Because God will not occupy a space where he is not welcome. And if you basically are idolatry of the self, well, then God is not welcome into yourself. And I guess that would be my small, tiny rant on that. Do you have something to add?
Actually, a little bit, yeah.
All right, let me play the video and then you can add to that.
So, with respect to the idea of cross-dressing and the transgender argument. Now, I understand a lot of the political arguments that get put into this, and some of them concerning psychology. And everybody thinks that the conservative Christian movement is being ridiculous when they make the assumption that in many cases, people who would otherwise identify as opposite their own gender are doing so for sexual reasons. But even Talmudic Jews had this idea. One of the main reasons they give for the prohibition against cross-dressing is because the presumption is that it's being done to gain a closer access to the opposite gender for sexual reasons. And so this stipulation against cross-dressing, against the transgenderism as it is, to protect those who would be what's the word I'm looking for? Those who would be victimized by predators. That goes back as far as the Talmud itself goes back, right? This is very old, even in Judaism. So it's nobody's out of their minds, because, well, we see this again even in Greek culture. The word pedagogue is used, right, in the New Testament, that the Torah is the pedagogue. Now we read that as schoolmaster. It actually more closely means a bodyguard, right? The primary duty of a pedagogue, this bodyguard, was to escort a child of a noble family to and from school and make sure that he didn't get raped by one of the effeminate Greek men in society on his way to school, because that's how common it was for the more vulnerable to be victimized by predators. And so that's what a pedagogue was a bodyguard to make sure that this boy didn't get assaulted. So yeah, that actually ties directly into the idea of cross-dressing, and that's my rant on that.
Very well. Yeah, you went a completely different direction with that. But yeah, so in a nutshell, we can wrap up. The Corinthians passage on head covering is primarily about hair and cross-dressing. And we actually covered it quite a bit today on the issue of cross-dressing, and how the Tallit is, and this is very much a cultural thing. It's culturally relevant in the Corinthian passage, so you have to read it through the cultural lens. And with that cultural lens, the Tallit is the man's garment, and a head covering is a woman's garment, as well as long hair. And for a man to have long hair and shave his face to appear effeminate is a violation of not only these cultural things, but also it's considered cross-dressing via the Torah. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we've covered here. And again, this was a problem in the Corinthian church. To appear more effeminate, the men to do that was very common, and for women didn't usually cover their hair because that was seen as a slave thing to do. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. But
They're asking if there's going to be an after party today.
Should I get a glass of mead? I think, yeah. Are we doing an after party?
Yeah, I mean that's the custom, right?
It is. I just need to refill my coffee. And do you want to?
Well, you know what? It's after 12, so I am probably going to get a beer.
Oh, it is after 12. Look at that. And then last thing before we go, for those of you. This thing here. This is a brand spanking new, shiny, still saran wrapped, beautiful Lessons in Tanya 5-volume set by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi.
The very first item that will be in the alternate media bookshelf starter kit.
Bookshelf, all caps, starter kit. We're doing a big giveaway. There's going to be easily $500 worth of books in the starter kit. Easily, probably more than that. And to enter into the giveaway, you have to be a Patreon or patron, whatever, on our Patreon. And to get an entry into the drawing, the memberships start at just $1. And so if you get the $1 membership, you will be added into the drawing for the bookshelf starter kit. You got to say it that way. That's the thing.
Yep.
And that's just one piece of the bookshelf. We're going to put a Chumash in there, a Siddur in there. There's going to be all sorts of other really great materials that we're always referencing.
Just got an idea. We should throw in a flat cap with one of these prizes.
We absolutely should. We absolutely should. Yeah. Yeah. Wow, the bookshelf flat cap starter kit. I think he paused on me. What happened? Oh, he's down. Something happened. That's fine. We're about to go to the after party anyway. But so a brand spanking new. I think this book set retails for something I have this exact copy. It retails for something like $160 or something like that, I think, at retail price, whatever. But yeah, we're giving this away and a bunch of other stuff in the starter kit. And we're also doing smaller giveaways here and there. We'll do single book giveaways to the patrons as well. So as long as you're a patron at the $1 level, it doesn't matter after that. We lost him. It's fine. You will have an entry into the giveaway, and you'll either win a single book or prize like that, and then the big grand prize will be given away to one lucky patron for easily. I'm going to go ahead and say it. The list we put together, it's something like $595 worth of books. Oh, and he's back. There you go. Hey,
yeah, my internet took a crap on me.
That's fine. Yeah. So we're at 3 minutes over. Actually, no, we're not 3 minutes over because we have the 5-minute countdown. So we're still just under the hour and a half mark. But yeah, I just all I did was describe how we're also doing smaller book giveaways to the patrons as well. And it will include. I think I lost you again. Darn it.
Yeah, for a minute you did.
Nope. There you go. But it'll include bits and pieces of Midrash, Mishnah, other stuff like that. So,
yep.
But yeah, all those books that we're constantly referencing and recommending to other people, many of those are going to be in the kit. Some that we've never really talked about or maybe only mentioned once will be in the kit. Yeah, so definitely doing that. So if you want in on that action, we appreciate the support of every single patron. Seriously, every single dollar counts. It really helps. And then we can do more giveaways like this because of you guys. And so we really, really appreciate it. And we want to show you that appreciation by giving some of that back. to some people who could really use some of these resources. And so, and I think that's it for the announcements. Have you got anything else?
I have nothing else. So yeah, we can shut this down. And we will be having an after party in the Discord. You can't access it unless you're a patron. So there's another good reason to become a patron to
So
chat
many
with
perks
us
for
personally.
$1.
Right. If you want to chat with us personally, after these events, when we hold them, you can do that in the Discord. We'll be in there for about an hour, sometimes longer, sometimes way longer. And we just sit there and we have a good time. It's cordial, it's fun, and we all kind of have a little celebration and chat.
Yeah, and that's your chance to 1v1 us. Like if you have certain questions that you really want our like if say you left a comment and we ignored it or just missed it or something, that's your chance to like confront us and ask us whatever you want. We're there. We do this so that we can provide a better learning experience. Doing live shows, you can only accomplish so much. So we've set that up for you guys. And we're only able to do that because of your generous support. So again, thank you for being a supporter if you are. And if you're considering, thank you once again. And part of that thank you is we try to give back to you as much as possible and make your money worth it, more than worth it. We try to give you that $1 worth in, tenfold. But tenfold is still only $10. 100-fold. All right. So I think that's it. I'm going to put up the patron special
shout
thanks
out to our patrons.
But once I do this, it cuts off all the microphones to everybody. So everybody have a wonderful morning. Thanks for joining us for brunch. And l'chaim. Oh, actually, I can keep it up like this. Look at that. Thank you to our special thanks to our patron, top tier, Tommy Deem, Frank Julie, Josh, Misty, Emily, Guillermo, Lowell, and Scott Councilman. I only like saying his last name because it's so
professional,
so proper. And to our scholars, thank you again to Chris, Joshua, J.I. Rowe, and I think it's Talia. I think it's how you say that.
Talia.
Just making sure I don't want to botch anybody's name. So once again, thank you guys. And now we're going to end it. So have a great day. We'll see you in the Discord.